Hey, it has been well over a year since I posted my first couple of YouTube videos, and let's be honest, they weren't really any good. In the meantime, I kinda put YouTube aside and made sure I improved my skills. Unfortunately, about a week ago, I managed to tear a muscle in my left calf during a sporting accident. This made getting around a lot harder, but on the bright side, I have a lot more spare time now, which I'm gonna use to kinda get back into YouTube. The subject of today is building your own PC, as you could have guessed by the boxes on the desk behind me. I know there are already a lot of YouTube videos about building your own PC out there, but I kinda wanna give you my take on it, and maybe you might learn something. So in this video, we're gonna go over all the parts we used for this build. I'm gonna explain to you how we're gonna put the system together, and we're going to install the Windows operating system. In the end, we're going to do a little stress testing and making sure every component is running up to spec. So without further ado, let's go! So the PC we're building today is going to be a workstation PC. Keep in mind though, these parts are pretty expensive and might not be the right choice for you if you're building a gaming or daily driving type PC. With that said, let's go check them out. First up, we get the motherboard, which is one of the newest creator boards from ASUS. We are talking about the Asus ProArt X570 Creator Wi-Fi. This board has a total of 3 M.2 NVMe slots and has not one but 2 Ethernet connection ports, one 2.5 and one 10 gigabit. It also has 2 Thunderbolt 4 slots and Wi-Fi 6, which will make this board a perfect base for this AMD build. This motherboard is going to be the home to a 5900X AMD CPU. I don't really have to explain, this is a beast when it comes to straight up processing power and multitasking. To keep this bad boy cool, we went with the Be Quiet Darkrock Pro 4, which is a monster of a cooler. Hopefully it's going to keep the CPU cool under load while not being too loud. Moving on, we get some 64GB of 3600 DDR4 memory. This is every creator's dream, but not really necessary when you're just using your PC for gaming or normal everyday tasks. We went with the Corsair LPX low profile modules, because our CPU cooler is going to need all the space it can get. So let's talk graphics. For this build we ended up going with the EVGA RTX 3060 Ti, which is a really great card, but with the prices we are seeing today, it is kinda debatable if it's actually worth the money. For storage, we're going with the top of the line Samsung 980 Pro NVMe SSDs and some Western Digital HDDs. We got a 1TB OS drive, 2TB storage drive and a 500GB scratch disk, and a whopping 12TB of HDD storage. These are some high-end storage devices, but they come at a hefty price tag, which for most people will just not be worth it. To provide all those components with enough power, we are going with the RM850X Corsair modular power supply, which is going to provide enough power for all our components without running into any limit. And since it's a modular power supply, it's going to make cable management a lot easier. And finally, everything will be neatly built into this case right here, the Be Quiet Silent Base 802, which is a pretty large case with good airflow, and most importantly, it will keep this PC running nice and quiet. First of all, we're going to need a decent set of screwdrivers and a working mat or some other kind of protection for your desk. You're also going to need a set of cutting pliers, zip ties, and a USB drive with at least 8GB of storage to install your operating system. Little note though, you might have come across those electric static wristbands, which are supposed to unload any charge you have built up in your body so you don't kill your parts. While this may have been useful in the past, today it's not likely you will be able to kill your parts with just static energy. That said, if you want to go out and buy it, that's fine, but it's not a requirement. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be careful. You should not be building your PC wearing wool socks and running around on a carpet. That said, you go get your tools and I'll be cleaning out the desk behind me. When we're building a PC, we always want to start with the motherboard. This is the most important part because this is the central component in which we will be plugging all the other parts. When opening the box, we'll find on the left side a smaller box containing the Wi-Fi antenna and of course the motherboard itself. Right underneath the motherboard we find two other compartments. In the right one we find a disk with drivers, some papers you will probably never read, and of course most importantly the manual. If you're ever in doubt, just go read the manual. 9 out of 10 it will tell you exactly what you should be doing. On the left side underneath the lid we find some extra support for the SSDs, a pack of 2 SATA cables and a DisplayPort cable. So now that we get the motherboard unpacked and ready to go, it's time to go and install the CPU. When installing the CPU, be careful to not drop it or bend any of its pins. Also try not to touch the heatsink too much because you don't want to get the grease of your hands on the surface, because this may cause drops in thermal performance. However, if you manage to get the CPU dirty, don't worry, just use some clean cotton pads and some isopropyl alcohol and carefully wipe it down. To install the CPU, you're first going to open the socket by pulling up the little lever. Once that's done, you're going to look for the little marks on the CPU and the motherboard socket. Line up the little triangles and slowly place the CPU onto the socket. When all the pins are where they should be, the CPU will just fall into place. When the CPU is seated correctly, you can lock the socket by pushing down the lever. Now the CPU should be installed correctly. Now it's time to install the RAM memory. These modules go in the RAM slots on the motherboard. If you only have 2 memory modules, you will be using slot A2 and B2. If you have 4 modules like we do here, you don't have to worry about that. When putting the RAM into the slots, make sure the slots are open by pressing down the little clips on the top side. Now you can install your RAM modules. Line up the module with the slot and ensure that the notch in the stick lines up with the slot. Now you can just push the memory module straight down until you hear a click. This means the module is correctly seated. You can do this for all the remaining modules. Now it's time to unbox and install the M.2 SSDs. If you have only one SSD and more slots, you should most of the time choose the slot closest to the processor, unless your manual says otherwise. By this logic, we will install our 1TB OS drive in the single slot at the top, right under the processor, and our scratch disk and storage drives in the remaining 2 slots at the bottom. So first up, to get to the SSD socket, we have to remove the heatsink. Depending on the physical size of your SSD, you might have to adjust the spacer, which will hold your SSD in place. However, the most common size is 2280, and most motherboards come with this configuration pre-installed, so probably all you have to do is just slide it in. When sliding the SSD in the socket, you need to angle it a little, as I am showing you right here. When you have the angle right, push it in until the drive is fully seated in the socket. Now you can push it down and secure it with a screw, or if you have a newer motherboard like this one, you might have some kind of plastic locking mechanism. Now you can screw your heat shield back onto the motherboard. Don't forget to remove the protective film of the thermal pad. When you tighten the screws on the shield, make sure they are just hand tight. There is no need to over tighten them. This may cause bending the drive and potentially breaking it. If you have more than one drive, you can install the other ones in the same way. So before we're going to apply the thermal paste and install the cooler, we are going to install the cooler's mounts. It's easier to do this first so we don't have to mess around with it once the CPU has thermal paste on it. Depending on the manufacturer of your CPU, whether it's Intel or AMD, you will need to choose the correct mounts and install them according to the manual. This may vary a little depending on the type and manufacturer of the cooler you're using. So now that we have installed the cooler mount, we can drop the motherboard in our case. Little warning before we install the motherboard, because a lot of motherboards come with a separate I/O shield. Ours has an I/O shield attached directly to the board, but a lot don't. Anyway, don't forget to install it. It's a real pain in the ass if you find out at the end of your build you forgot to install the shield. To install the motherboard, it's easier if the case is laying down on one side. Just be careful to not scratch any of the panels while moving it around. You're probably best off putting something under it for protection. Then just slowly lower the board in the case and line it up with the screw holes. Now it's time to screw it down. And again, take it easy on the torque, you don't want to strip any of the threads. Alright, let's apply some thermal paste and install the cooler. Make sure your CPU and cooler are totally clean. You don't want any dirt or finger grease messing with your thermals. A lot of coolers come with thermal paste pre-applied from the factory, so if you don't feel comfortable doing this, you can just install your cooler as is. I like to use my own thermal paste, which today is the Arctic Silver 5. To apply the thermal paste, I like to use the butter toast technique, which is, as the name implies, applying the thermal paste evenly across the CPU. But people have tested different application methods and it doesn't really matter. As long as you don't use too much or too little, you should be fine. When the paste is applied, we're going to put the cooler on there. If you have an AIO water cooling system, you should probably figure out where to mount a radiator and install it before you mount the cooler block. Common places to install the radiator are on the front or the top of the case. So let's mount the cooler. Do this very gently and make sure there are no protective films still on the cooler. If the cooler has thermal paste pre-applied but you used your own, remove the paste that's applied from the factory. Then we can lower the cooler and make sure it's lined up with the CPU. When you're positive everything is correctly seated and you're happy with the positioning, you can gently screw down the cooler. When screwing the cooler down, don't use too much force. You just want the cooler and CPU to sit tightly together without putting unnecessary strain on it. When the cooler is screwed down, you're going to look for the CPU fan headers and attach the fan cables. This is going to make sure the fans on the cooler are spinning accordingly to the CPU temperature. After we install the cooler, we can carefully lift the case back up and install the hard drives. Most cases will have some kind of mounting rack where you can install your hard drives. We're going to take the drive mount out of the rack and mount the HDD to the mount with the provided screws and place it back in the case. Some HDDs are very susceptible to ripping the threads by providing too much torque, so be extra careful. No need to worry about connecting anything yet, we will do this later on. So now it's time to finally start connecting these wires. If you look carefully, you can see that these wires are coming from the front panel of your case. The wire with the blue on top are your USB ports. Then we also have the connectors for the power, reset and LED indicators, and of course the audio cable. First, let's connect the USB cable from the case to the front panel connector on the motherboard. I find this connector can be a real pain sometimes, so take your time. If you have a newer generation of case and motherboard, you may have a USB-C connection. If you have a connector on the motherboard for this cable, you can install it as well. This connector only fits in one way, so check the orientation before you try to plug it in. Alright, you really want to pay attention here because this part is where you could possibly make a mistake. These connectors are all 1 or 2 pin female connectors, so this means you can install them anywhere. This means there is no safety. So be careful plugging them in and make sure you have the correct pins. If there is ever a moment you're not sure, just check the manual. This will tell you exactly which pin goes where. Also, most of the time there are indicators on the motherboard and connectors. Also, some motherboards come with a little adapter. This makes it easier to plug the connectors in one by one and then plug in the adapter. This way you don't have to mess around with the pins on the motherboard. Alright, you can plug in the connectors in the front panel according to this schema or follow what I am doing. If you want, you can always pause this video and take your time. So first up, we're going to take the power switch connector and plug it in. This one has no specific orientation, so you can just connect it. Next up, we get the reset switch. Again, the same as with the power switch, no specific orientation, just plug it in. Then we get the HDD LED connector. This one has a specific orientation. Minus goes on the minus pin and plus goes on the plus pin. Make sure they match or your LED indicator won't work. Last up we get the power LED. These are two 1-pin connectors and must be plugged in the same as the HDD LED connector. Minus to minus and plus to plus. When you're done, double check your connections to be sure you did it correctly. The last one is the audio connector. There's only one way this connector will fit, so you can't be wrong here. Alright, we are almost there. Let's move on and install the power supply. Depending on the type of case you have, this will be easier or a little harder. But first, let's go over the cables we will be needing. So first, we will always need the 24-pin ADX cable, which we will plug into the two largest connectors available on the power supply. The other side of this cable will be plugged into the motherboard. Then, depending on what your CPU requires, you will be installing one or two 8-pin connectors. We will install those two cables right there where it says PCIe/CPU on the power supply. In most cases, you don't need the extra connector, but it's there anyway if in the future you would have a CPU which draws a lot more power or you're going to do some heavy overclocking. A little note, the other end of these connectors are the 8-pin connectors split in 4 and 4 to provide the CPU with power through the motherboard. Always plug in at least one full 8-pin connector. If you only plug in one 4-pin connector, your system might become unstable and crash due to a lack of power. For the GPU, we will be installing a PCIe cable. These cables have 6 pins on the power supply side and a total of 16 pins on the other side. Those 16 pins are divided over 4 connectors, 2 6-pin connectors and 2 2-pins. This is where the magic happens. A 2-pin and 16-pin connector can fit together to make an 8-pin. The amount of pins a GPU needs can range from 8 to 16 depending on how much power it needs. So later on you're going to be plugging in as many connectors as you can. If you have any hard drives or extra SSDs, or for that matter anything else that needs power like a fan controller or an RGB strip, you will need to plug in at least one or more SATA power cables, which are the 6-pin cables you plug into the peripheral/SATA connectors on the power supply. Now that we plugged in everything we need, we will go ahead and mount the power supply in our case. Depending on the case you have, you're going to slide it in through the side or through the back. The first option is definitely the hardest. Luckily, we got a case where it goes through the back. The process is fairly simple. You're going to unscrew the mount from the case and screw it on the back of the power supply using the provided screws. There are two ways you can mount the power supply: with the fan pointed upwards or downwards. You will want to mount it with the fan downwards. This ensures the power supply can pull in cold air from under the case to cool its components. Now that the power supply is securely screwed in place, we can provide all the components with power. For now, you don't really have to worry about the cable management. I personally like to set up the system and make sure everything works correctly before I go permanently route the cables. First off, we're going to plug in the big 24-pin connector into the motherboard. This can be a pain in the butt because the cables can be quite stiff and the connector doesn't always go in so easy. You might also have to use a considerably large amount of force to ensure the cable is fully seated. Do this carefully, but make sure the cable is fully connected or this might lead to damaged motherboard. Then we are going to install the CPU power cables. This might be a little hard to see, but this motherboard uses an 8 and 4-pin connector. As I said before, you always have to use at least 8 pins, but we get the 4-pin too, so we're going to plug it in as well. Alright, now let's route the PCIe cable through the slot in the case so we can use it for our graphics card, which we're going to install later. Then we can plug in all the devices that use SATA power cables. As I mentioned before, this can be hard drives, SSDs, fan controllers, you name it. In our case, we got 2 hard drives and a fan controller that came with the case. If you have a fan controller like we do here, you're going to plug the small 4-pin control connector in one of the chassis fan header pins on the motherboard. If you do not have a controller, you can just plug your case fans straight in the chassis header pins. These pins are located all over the board. So we provided our storage with power. Well, it also needs a way to transport data from the drive to the motherboard and vice versa. So we need to plug in SATA cables in the back of the hard drives or SSDs, and the other end in the SATA ports on the motherboard. Normally all SATA ports will have the same speed, but I like to use them in chronicle order, so you will have to check your manual to find out which port is the first one and so forth. Finally, we made it to the last part of our build, unboxing and installing the graphics card. To mount the GPU, you're going to remove the brackets in the back of the case. Depending on the card and the case, you may have to remove 2 or 3 brackets. In our case, we only have to remove 2 of them. Then you will press down the clip on the top PCIe slot and insert the card carefully. Once it's inserted correctly, you will hear a little click. Be careful, because at this point you didn't screw the card in place yet, so don't just let it hang there. Make sure you support the card and screw it in place using the screws you get from the brackets. When the card is in place, you can connect the appropriate amount of PCI power connectors. This can vary a little from card to card. In our case, we will need 2 8-pin connectors. Alright, so we actually completed the build. Now is probably a good time to go ahead and check if everything is installed correctly. When that is done, we can go ahead and create our Windows installation drive. To be able to install the operating system on our new PC, we need some kind of installation media, which we are going to create now using the USB stick. Today we will be installing the brand new Windows 11, but if you're installing Windows 10, that's fine too. The steps are pretty much the same. So let's get started. Alright, let's open up a new Google Chrome tab and search for microsoft.com/software download. Here you will find an overview of all the available operating systems that Microsoft offers. So we will be installing Windows 11, so let's click on that. Alright, so here we can find the installation assistant, the software to create an installation media, and the Windows 11 disk image. We will be needing to install the media creation tool, so go ahead and click the download. Once we open it up, we will be met with the terms of agreement, and of course we will just hit the accept button without reading it. After we get a few things ready for us, we can choose a version and a language, or use the recommended settings for the PC you're creating it on. I will just uncheck the recommended settings because I am okay with having English as a language and you can't really choose a version anyway. I don't really know why they put it in there as an option, because we will have to choose the version when we're installing the operating system on our PC. Next up, we will have to choose if you want to create a USB drive or a disk. Of course, we will go ahead and select USB drive. Then we will be prompted with the question to choose the drive we want to transform in a bootable drive. Make sure you check the right one, because going through the installation process it will format the drive and any files that were on there will be gone. When you are sure you selected the correct drive, click next and it will start creating a bootable drive. This can take a few good minutes. After a while it will say that your drive is ready. Click finish and you can take your drive out of the computer. You have now successfully created a Windows 11 installation drive. Alright, so you actually did it, you built your first PC. But before we're gonna hit the power button, we gotta make sure that everything is 100% connected. We don't want any loose connections or anything. If you have made sure of that, then you can go ahead and plug in a power cord and a wired keyboard. Then we're gonna take our USB stick with our operating system on it and plug it in the back of our motherboard. And of course, lastly, we need a monitor. If you have a graphics integrated CPU, you can plug your monitor directly into your motherboard. If not, you're gonna have to plug your monitor into your graphics card. Alright, last note though, we're going to install a fresh operating system, which means making a new partition. If all of your storage devices are brand new, you don't really need to worry about it. But if you have storage devices from an old PC with data on you don't really want to lose, then now might be the good time to unplug those devices. You will probably not be the first one to accidentally delete or overwrite any of your old data. With that said, let's see if we did a good job building this PC. Alright, all jokes aside, I hope your PC booted up just fine. If you have any problems, you can post your questions in the comments. When you boot up your PC, you are prompted with the Windows setup. On the first screen, you can choose the language, which I will leave as is. For the time and currency format, I will set this to Dutch Belgium. And for the keyboard, I will use United States International. But you can of course choose whatever fits you. When we click next, we are asked if we want to repair this PC or install a fresh Windows. We of course are going to install it. Then it will ask you if you have an activation key. If you have one, you can fill it in and click next, otherwise you can click the I don't have a product key link. Don't worry if you don't have a key yet, you can always activate your Windows later from inside the settings. Now we can actually choose which version of Windows we want to install. For the average everyday user there is not much of a difference, but I will leave this up to you. The difference between the normal version and the ones that have the letter N at the end is that the ones with the N don't have things like media player etc. pre-installed. In my experience this can give you some issues, so I would suggest to go with the normal version. I will be taking Windows 11 home for this tutorial. Then it will ask us if we want to agree to the licensing terms. Of course we just click accept and next. Next we can choose whether we want to upgrade our current installation or install a new one. Since we don't have one yet, we are going to hit the install Windows only button. Now it's time to choose the disk where you want to install your operating system. Depending on how many drives you currently have in your system, you will have multiple options. If all your drives are brand new, just pick one that you want as your Windows drive. If you have old drives or ones that have already been used, be extra careful you don't delete or overwrite any of your old data. I only have an 80 GB disk in here, so my choice is already made. Then when you click next, Windows is gonna start installing. This may take a while and your system might reboot a couple of times. So after a couple of minutes you will be prompted with the new Windows 11 setup. Then the first question it will be asking you is if this is your right country or region. Of course I will be selecting Belgium because that's the country I'm currently living in. So now it's actually asking you again for the right keyboard layout. I'm gonna again choose United States International. Then when we go on, it will ask us if we want to add an extra keyboard layout. I have no need for this, so I'm just gonna skip it. Then it will go ahead and check if there are any updates available. This might take a couple of minutes. So now it will let you set up a name for your device. You can't take any spaces, so I ended up with Windows_11. When you've set up a name, the system might reboot a couple of times before it lets you move on. So now you actually have to log in with your Microsoft account. If you don't have one already, you can create one right there, but there is unfortunately no way to use Windows without one. So now we can secure our PC by setting up a password. This password can contain any character as well as symbols and numbers. I'm using a 4-digit PIN here for convenience, but I suggest using at least a 16-character password if you're serious about security. Now if you have another PC with the same Microsoft account, you can now choose to restore any settings or maybe files from the other PC. I do have another PC, but I'm not gonna use it. I'm gonna set this PC up as a new device. So next it's going to ask you if it can use your location, send out any diagnostic data and personalize your ad experience. I want to keep every one of these to a minimum, so I'm going to choose the second option every time. Then it will ask you if you want to let it customize your experience for gaming or schoolwork or whatever. I don't really want it, so I'm just gonna skip ahead. Then it will give you the option to use OneDrive to back up any files you have on this PC. I want to install and set up OneDrive later, so for now I'm just going to choose the only save files to this PC option. Then lastly, it will ask you if you want to try out Microsoft Office 365. I already have a subscription, so I'm just gonna skip it. Then it's going to finally set everything up, and this might take a couple of minutes. So if everything went well, you have now installed Windows 11 and you're seeing the new and improved desktop. Now that we have confirmed that everything is working perfectly, we can shut down the PC and go ahead and do some cable management. So your PC is now up and running. You can shut it down and turn off the power supply and completely disconnect it from the power grid. We have now made sure that everything works perfectly, so we can now unplug and reroute the cables to your liking. This might take some practice, but if you're going through the trouble of building your PC from scratch, you might as well make sure everything is nice and clean. So now we actually have completely built a PC. Let's now also make sure it's running as good as it possibly can. To make sure this happens, we are going to install the latest drivers for our hardware and activate the improved memory profile. This way we make sure we leave no performance on the table. Let's boot the PC back up and let's see what we can do. Let's start with the drivers for the motherboard and CPU. To install these, we're going to the product page of your specific motherboard on the manufacturer's website. Once there, we're going to look for something along the lines of software or drivers. Once there, you will probably be able to choose your operating system and find the drivers available for your OS. Then you will download all the drivers. Once they have been downloaded, we're going to unpack them one by one and run the setup. This is pretty straightforward. Be careful because some of these drivers might require a reboot, so don't reboot yet if there are still other drivers installing. After we install the motherboard drivers, we can go ahead and install the drivers for our graphics card. Again, we go to the manufacturer's website and search for the correct driver, which is in my case the driver for the RTX 3060 Ti, and I will be installing the studio version of this, as this is a workstation. If you have an Nvidia graphics card, you have the option to install the GeForce Experience software, which lets you update and optimize your settings for your specific card, but this is totally up to you. I will just be installing the driver. Now that all the drivers are installed, it's time to set up the memory profile. As you can see, our memory is currently running at 2600 MHz, but these sticks are made to run at 3600 MHz, which is a significant bump in performance. Alright, let's reboot the PC and get in the BIOS. So when rebooting the PC, you want to smash the delete button as many times as you can until you're successfully entered the BIOS of your motherboard. And as you can see, our memory is still running at 2600 MHz. Right there where it says DOCP, you can select the drop down and choose memory profile 1. Yours might say something else, but as you can see, this profile is made by the manufacturer to run the RAM at its intended speed. As we are saving this, we can see what's about to change. Let's hit OK and reboot. So back in Windows, we can go and check and see if our RAM speed has changed. It looks like we are running at 3600 MHz right now, which is the result we intended. The last thing we are going to do now is check if all our components are running as they should be. We are going to do this by running a little benchmark test. First, we're going to download Open Hardware Monitor to keep an eye on our temperatures. Then we go to the website userbenchmark.com, where we can download a tool that will perform a quick test and give us a detailed analysis of our hardware and rank us compared to other people with the same hardware. This is not a complete stress test, but it gives us an idea if our components are performing as they should be. So let's download and run the tool and see where we stand. So we get the hardware monitor open and are about to begin the test. Keep in mind I'm recording in 4K, so the score of the graphics card will probably take a hit since it's also doing the recording. Anyway, let's run the test and see what's going on. During the test, the temperature of the CPU, motherboard and graphics card were all within the normal expected operating ranges. This tells us the cooler and airflow inside the case are doing their job. And the results are in. As we can see, everything from CPU to SSDs to RAM is performing very well, and in most cases above expectations. As we expected, the GPU took a little hit and is performing a little under the expected results, but this is totally normal since it was recording the test. So this concludes our video. Thank you so much for watching. If you followed along building your own PC, I hope everything went well and you're ready to start working or gaming on it. Our build went fantastic and I think my friend is going to be very happy with it. If you like this video, please consider hitting the like button, and if you want to see more of me, please consider subscribing. With that said, thank you so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one.